My sister went through my late husband's things without asking, but she didn't know he left a letter describing exactly what she was looking for. She was hunting for something valuable, something she felt she was owed, tearing through the sacred quiet of my grief to find it. What she couldn't possibly have known was that my David, my sweet, thoughtful David, had seen it all coming. He had left behind a letter, all right. A letter that described the one thing in this world she wanted most, and in his own loving words, laid out the one and only reason she would never ever get her hands on it. That letter didn't just expose her greed for what it was. It revealed a secret David had kept for 20 years. A quiet act of kindness that grew in the dark and blossomed just in time to save me from losing everything I had left. 31 years. That's how long I had with David. 31 years of waking up to the smell of his coffee, a scent so deep and rich it felt like a promise that the day would be a good one. He was a man of simple routines that felt like grand gestures of love. Every morning he'd be up before the sun, and by the time my eyes fluttered open, there'd be a mug on my nightstand, steam curling up like a little prayer. He'd just sit there in the armchair in the corner of our bedroom, reading the paper, waiting for me. He never rushed me. He'd just look up over his glasses when he heard me stir. And that smile. Lord, that smile could have melted the polar ice caps. It was a smile that said, "There you are. I've been waiting for you. The day can start now." We built our life in a house that felt more like a living thing than just wood and nails. It was a 2-story colonial with a porch that wrapped all the way around, nestled on a quiet street with oak trees older than the town itself. David bought it when it was a wreck, a forgotten place with peeling paint and a sad, sagging roof. Everyone told him he was crazy, but he saw what it could be. We spent the first 5 years of our marriage with paint in our hair and sawdust on our clothes, bringing that old house back to life. Every wall, every floorboard, held a memory. The kitchen was where he taught me how to make his mother's gumbo, his big hands patiently guiding mine as we stirred the roux, his laughter echoing off the yellow walls when I got flour on my nose. The living room, with its big stone fireplace, was where we'd curl up on cold winter nights, the fire crackling and popping, his arm a safe, heavy weight around my shoulders. His study was the heart of the house. It was wall-to-wall books, the air thick with the smell of old paper and leather. That was his sanctuary. The place he went to think, to dream, to be quiet. And he always left the door open for me. Our love wasn't the loud, flashy kind you see in movies. It was a quiet, steady flame. It was in the way he'd reach for my hand when we were driving, his thumb stroking the back of my knuckles. It was in the way he'd leave little notes for me tucked inside my recipe books. It was in the way he looked at me, even after 3 decades, like I was the most beautiful, most fascinating woman he'd ever laid eyes on. He made me feel seen. He made me feel safe. With David, I was home. The world could be raging outside, but inside our house, inside his arms, there was only peace. Then there was my sister, Sharon. She's 5 years younger than me, and sometimes it felt like she was a lifetime behind. Growing up, I was always the one looking out for her. I was the responsible one, the one who made sure she did her homework, the one who covered for her when she snuck out. I loved her, I truly did. But our love was complicated. It was like a tangled ball of yarn. You could see the threads of affection, but they were all knotted up with something else, something I couldn't quite name back then. Now I know what it was. It was envy. A quiet, simmering thing that lived just beneath the surface of her smile. When I met David, it got worse. He was everything she thought a man should be. Handsome, steady, ambitious but kind. He tried so hard with her. He treated her like his own sister, helped her husband Frank find work when his business ventures went south, which they often did. We'd have them over for dinner, and David would listen for hours as Frank talked about his latest get-rich-quick scheme, nodding and offering encouragement. I'd watch Sharon from across the table, her eyes scanning our home, lingering on a new painting or a piece of furniture, and her smile would get just a little too tight at the corners. She'd say things that sounded like compliments but felt like tiny little cuts. "Oh, this is just beautiful," she'd say, running a hand over the dining room table. "It must be so nice not to have to worry about things." It was never what she said, but how she said it. The implication was always there, that we had it easy. That we were lucky. She never saw the years of hard work, the sacrifices, the late nights David put in to build his construction business from the ground up. She just saw the result, and she resented it. I tried to bridge that gap. I'd give her things, lend her money we both knew she'd never pay back, thinking that maybe if I just gave her enough, that hungry look in her eyes would finally go away. But it never did. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. I remember one night, years ago, David came home later than usual. It was past 9 and I was starting to worry. He walked in, looking tired but with that familiar gentle light in his eyes. He told me he'd been with an old army buddy of his, a man named Marcus Henderson. I vaguely remembered the name. He was a quiet, bookish man who had been through a lot overseas. David said Marcus had poured his life savings into opening a little bookstore downtown, a dream he'd held on to through all the bad times. But the business was struggling, and the bank was about to foreclose. David had spent the entire evening at the bank with him, not just offering advice, but co-signing a loan. A substantial one. I remember feeling a little knot of worry in my stomach. Frank's failed businesses had made me wary. But David just took my hands in his and said, "Baby, you have to have faith in people. Marcus is good soil. All he needs is a little water." Then he smiled that slow, easy smile of his. "Besides, kindness is an investment. You plant a seed, you don't stare at it every day waiting for it to sprout. You do the right thing. You trust it's going to grow when the time is right, and you let it be." I remember just nodding, my worry melting away under the warmth of his conviction. It was just another story of his generosity, another example of my David seeing the best in people. I tucked the memory away, a sweet but unimportant little anecdote. I had no idea that seed he planted in the dark, for a man I barely knew, was a seed meant for me. I had no idea it would one day be my harvest. The day David died, the world didn't just go gray. It went silent. The heart attack was massive, instantaneous. One moment he was laughing at something on the television, the next he was gone. The silence he left behind was a physical thing. It filled every corner of our house, swallowing up the echoes of his laughter, the sound of his footsteps on the stairs. The house we had built together suddenly felt like a museum of a life I used to have. His coffee mug was still by the sink. His reading glasses were on the nightstand. His scent lingered on his pillow, a ghost I couldn't bear to wash away. For the first few weeks there was a flood of people. Casseroles and condolences. Sharon was there, of course, playing the part of the grieving sister-in-law. She held my hand at the funeral, her grip surprisingly tight. She cried, but her tears seemed different from mine. Mine were a storm, a ragged, tearing thing that left me hollowed out. Hers were neat, tidy little drops, as if for show. In the blur of those early days, I was grateful for her presence, for anyone who could fill a bit of the crushing emptiness. But then, as it always does, the flood receded. The phone calls stopped. The casseroles ran out. And I was left alone in the quiet, with just my grief and a mountain of paperwork. That's when the second wave of the storm hit. David had always handled the finances. He'd tell me not to worry, that he had everything taken care of, that I'd be secure no matter what. I believed him. I never thought to question it. But as I started sorting through the papers in his study, a cold, creeping dread began to take hold. I found the life insurance policy, and the number looked big enough, a comfort. But then a letter came from the insurance company. They were invoking a clause, something buried deep in the fine print about a pre-existing heart condition he'd been diagnosed with years ago and had never told me about. He probably didn't want me to worry. The payout was going to be a fraction of what we'd planned for. A tiny fraction. Suddenly the letters started changing. They weren't condolences anymore. They were notices. Past due. The mortgage, the property taxes, the business loans he'd taken out for a new development project. The numbers swam before my eyes, a dizzying, terrifying mess. The man who had always made me feel so safe had, in his desire to protect me from worry, left me utterly exposed. The threat of losing the house, our house, became real. It was a constant, low-grade fever of fear in the back of my mind. The thought of being forced to leave the place where every wall held a piece of him was a pain almost as sharp as losing him in the first place. I spent weeks trying to figure a way out. I talked to the bank, but they were polite and immovable. I tried to sell some of his business assets, but everything was tied up in legal knots that would take months, maybe years, to untangle. The foreclosure notice wasn't a possibility anymore. It was an inevitability. A date circled in red on my calendar. I was at the end of my rope, hanging on by a thread. And so, I did the one thing I swore I would never do. I swallowed every last ounce of my pride, picked up the phone, and called Sharon. I asked if I could come over. I needed to see her face to face. I needed her to see the desperation in my eyes. I drove to her house, a smaller, newer place in a subdivision on the other side of town. The whole way there, I rehearsed what I would say, trying to find the right words that would appeal to the sister I knew, the little girl whose hand I used to hold, not the woman with the hungry eyes. I sat on her beige sofa, the fabric stiff and unwelcoming, and I laid my soul bare. I told her everything. The insurance policy, the debts, the foreclosure. My voice was small, trembling. I didn't ask for a handout. I asked for a loan, just enough to stop the foreclosure, to give me time to sort things out. I promised her, on David's memory, that I would pay back every single penny with interest. I looked at her, my sister, and I begged. She let me finish. She sat there, across from me in a matching armchair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. When she finally spoke, her voice was as cold and hard as a block of ice. "Alone," she said, the words clipped and sharp. "You're sitting here, in my house, asking me for a loan." She stood up and began to pace, her movements agitated, angry. "For 30 years I have watched you. I have watched you and David live your perfect little life in your perfect big house. The fancy vacations you took, the expensive cars, the dinners you threw where you'd show off your latest purchase. Did you ever once, in all that time, stop and think about us? About me and Frank? Do you have any idea how many times his business nearly went under? How many nights I stayed up sick with worry, wondering how we were going to make the mortgage? And what did we get from you? A pat on the back and an invitation to your next Christmas party." Her voice was rising, laced with a bitterness so potent it felt like it could poison the air in the room. David was always flashing his money around, playing the big shot for his friends, but he never really helped his own family, not in the ways that mattered. And now you come to me, crying poor? I don't believe it for a second. She stopped pacing and turned to face me, her eyes narrowed into slits. I know David. He was too smart, too shrewd, not to have money tucked away somewhere. Stocks, bonds, a secret account, something. And you're sitting on it, aren't you? You're sitting on it pretending to be some poor, helpless widow so you don't have to share what's rightfully ours, what David owed us. I was too stunned to speak. The cruelty of it, the sheer injustice of her words, stole the air from my lungs. "Sharon, that's not true," I whispered, but my voice was a ghost. "Don't you lie to me," she snapped. "You think I'm going to give you my hard-earned money so you can keep living in that palace while we struggle? No. You can sell that house, just like normal people have to do when they can't afford their lives. You can pack up your precious memories and see what the real world is like for a change. Maybe then you'll finally understand what it's been like for the rest of us." She walked to the door and opened it. It was a clear dismissal. I stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I walked out without another word, the sound of the door shutting behind me like a gunshot. The betrayal was a physical pain, a hot, sharp thing in my chest. It wasn't just that she'd said no. It was that she had taken my grief, my fear, my deepest vulnerability, and twisted it into something ugly, something I could be punished for. She hadn't just refused to help me. She had enjoyed watching me fall. The drive home was a blur of tears. I stumbled back into my empty house, the silence now feeling hostile, suffocating. A few days passed in a fog of despair. I barely ate, barely slept. One afternoon I went into David's study, looking for an old photo album, needing to see his smile. The moment I stepped into the room, I felt it. A wrongness. The air was different. A stack of papers on his desk was slightly askew. The top drawer of his filing cabinet, the one where he kept his personal documents, was not quite closed. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread. I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and sharp as a shard of glass, that Sharon had been here. She had a key, one I'd given her years ago for emergencies. She had used my grief as a cover, my absence as an opportunity. She had come into our most sacred space and put her greedy, grasping hands on my husband's life. She was hunting. And I was utterly, completely alone. The official foreclosure notice arrived a week later, taped to the front door. A bright pink piece of paper that felt like a public shaming. Seeing it there, for all my neighbors to see, was the final humiliation. The fight went out of me. There was nothing left to do. It was over. I was going to lose my home. I decided to start with David's study. It was the hardest room, and I knew if I could get through it, I could get through the rest. I bought boxes from the hardware store and began the heartbreaking work of dismantling our life. Each object I touched was a fresh wave of grief. His favorite fountain pen, the ink long dry. The worn leather armchair with the imprint of his body still faintly visible. A copy of his favorite book of poetry, with a passage he'd underlined, a love poem that I knew was meant for me. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of our 31 years, and I packed. I packed away his dreams, our memories, the man I loved. I had given up all hope. This was my rock bottom, a quiet, lonely place of absolute defeat. I worked my way to the large built-in bookshelf that covered one entire wall. On the very top shelf, covered in a thick layer of dust, was a small, unassuming cardboard box labeled Old Ventures. I had to stand on a chair to get it down. I figured it was just old tax records, things I needed to shred. I almost didn't open it. But something made me pause. I sat on the floor and lifted the lid. Inside, among meaningless receipts and defunct business cards, was a worn manila folder. The tab simply said, Henderson's Books. A faint flicker of a memory, the one of David coming home late, of him talking about his army buddy. I opened the folder. Inside was the original loan document he had co-signed all those years ago. And stamped across the front, in big, bold red letters, were the words paid in full. Beneath it was another document, something that looked more formal. A partnership agreement. Seeing Marcus Henderson's name in David's familiar handwriting, it felt like a loose end. A final piece of my husband's life that I needed to put to rest. With nothing left to lose, I decided I should at least return the paid note to Mr. Henderson. It felt like the right thing to do, the last honorable act I could perform in David's name, before I walked away from his house forever. I drove downtown, the old documents on the passenger seat beside me. I expected to find a small, struggling shop, maybe even a closed-down storefront. I pictured a sad, dusty place, a testament to a failed dream. But the address led me to one of the most beautiful buildings in the city's newly revitalized historic district. It was a 3-story brick building with huge glass windows. A handsome dark green sign hung over the door in elegant gold script. Henderson's Books. It wasn't just a bookstore. It was an institution. The place was bustling with people, the warm light from inside spilling out onto the sidewalk. I walked in, feeling small and out of place in my grief-worn clothes. A young woman at the counter asked if she could help me, and I asked, my voice barely a whisper, if Mr. Henderson was in. She gave me a kind smile and pointed towards a grand wooden staircase. His office is on the 3rd floor, she said. I climbed the stairs, my hand trailing along the polished banister. The walls were lined with photos of the bookstore's history, of author signings and community events. I reached the third floor and found a door with a simple brass plate that read, Marcus Henderson. I knocked softly. The man who opened the door was not the struggling, haunted man I vaguely remembered. He was tall and distinguished, with kind eyes and a warm, welcoming smile. He recognized me instantly. His face fell when he saw the look in my eyes. He knew. He ushered me into a beautiful office, filled with even more books and comfortable leather chairs. He offered his deepest, most sincere condolences, telling me what a great man David had been, how he owed him everything. I thanked him, and then I pulled the old folder from my purse. "I'm so sorry to bother you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm packing up David's things, and I found this. I just wanted to return it to you. To close out the books, I guess." I handed him the paid loan note. He took it, a look of confusion on his face. Then I handed him the partnership agreement. "And I suppose we need to formally dissolve this," I said. He looked from the papers to my face, his brow furrowed. "Dissolve it?" he asked, his voice gentle. "My dear, there's nothing to dissolve. David didn't just co-sign a loan for me. He became my partner. He gave me the capital, but more than that, he gave me the confidence to build this. He was a silent partner, but he owned 50% of everything. This building, the business. Half of it belonged to him." I stared at him, not understanding. "Belonged," I repeated numbly. "No," he said, shaking his head and giving me a small, sad smile. "That's not right. Half of it belongs to him. And now, it belongs to you." He reached into his desk and pulled out a thick, formally bound document. He opened it and turned it around for me to see. David was the smartest man I ever knew. He insisted we put a clause in our partnership agreement, right from the very beginning. He said it was his rainy day plan for his girl. He pointed to a paragraph, and I leaned in to read the legal language. But the meaning was clear. In the event of David's death, his entire 50% share of the business, the building, the inventory, all of it, transferred directly and immediately to his wife. I looked up at Mr. Henderson, my eyes wide with disbelief. What does this mean?" I whispered. He looked at me with such profound kindness. "It means," he said softly, "that you are the co-owner of one of the most successful independent bookstores in the state. It means you don't have to worry about the mortgage. It means you don't have to worry about anything, ever again. The seed. David's seed of kindness, planted 20 years ago in the dark soil of a friend's desperation, had grown into a mighty oak, and its branches were now sheltering me from the storm." I sat there, in that beautiful office, and for the first time in months I cried. But these were not the tears of grief or despair. They were tears of overwhelming, impossible gratitude. My David, my sweet, thoughtful David. Even in death, he had found a way to keep his promise. He had found a way to keep me safe. A month later, the world was a different color. The foreclosure was a forgotten nightmare. The debts were paid. The house was quiet again, but it was a peaceful quiet now, not a suffocating one. I was working with Marcus, learning the business, finding a new purpose. One afternoon, there was a furious banging on the front door. I knew who it was before I even opened it. Sharon stood on my porch, her face a mask of rage. She'd heard the rumors, seen that the house wasn't for sale. "Where did you get the money?" she spat, her voice dripping with accusation. "You had it all along, didn't you? You were lying to me, making me feel guilty." The old me would have shrunk back. The old me would have tried to explain, to justify, to make her understand. But I was not the old me. Grief had burned away my need for her approval. David's final gift had given me a strength I never knew I had. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see my little sister. I saw a stranger, a woman consumed by her own bitterness. I opened the door wider. "Come in, Sharon," I said, my voice calm and even. "You're right, David did leave something behind. In fact, he left something specifically for you." She followed me into the living room, her eyes darting around, probably looking for signs of new wealth. I went to the mantelpiece over the fireplace and picked up a thick cream-colored envelope. David's name and address were written on the back in his familiar strong script. I had found it in his lockbox, right where Marcus said it would be. I handed it to her. "What is this?" she asked, snatching it from my hand. "It's a letter. From David. He wrote it for you." She tore it open, her movements jerky and impatient. I watched her face as she read. I watched the confusion turn to shock, and the shock curdle into a pale, sick-looking disbelief. David's words, his kind, loving, terrible words, were doing their work. I knew what the letter said. I had read it a dozen times. "My dearest Sharon," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone. I know how much you have always loved Mama's pearl necklace. I know it broke your heart when Daddy had to sell it all those years ago. I want you to know that I bought it back, and I've been keeping it safe for you all this time. It was always my intention for you to have it. It's in my old lockbox in the study. I am leaving it in my wife's care, and she has the key. I have told her to give the necklace to you when she feels you have truly been a sister to her. When you have stood by her and supported her through her darkest days after I'm gone. I know you will. Your family, and family takes care of each other. With all my love, David." The thing she had been hunting for. The valuable heirloom she was convinced I was hiding from her. The reason she had violated my home and my trust. It had been there all along, waiting for her. A gift. And the only thing standing between her and that gift was her own character. Her own greed and cruelty had become the very lock on the box. She looked up from the letter, her face ashen, her mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw the full, devastating weight of her loss. She had not just lost a necklace. She had lost everything. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I just looked at her, with a profound and weary sadness. All those years of trying to earn her love, of trying to fill the hole in her heart, and it had all been for nothing. David had seen her more clearly than I ever had. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment. Then I said, quietly, "I believe you still have my house key." She fumbled in her purse, her hands shaking, and pulled out the key. She placed it on the table between us without meeting my eyes. And then she turned and walked out of my house, and out of my life, forever. I live a quiet life now. I didn't sell the house. I could never leave this place. It's filled with too much of him. I work with Marcus at the bookstore. We started a foundation in David's name, a literacy program for underprivileged kids. It feels right. It feels like I'm not just living off his legacy. I'm helping it grow. I am at peace, a peace I thought I'd never feel again. I am safe, I am home. You know, my David used to say that kindness was an investment. You plant a seed, and you trust it'll grow when the time is right. Sometimes, the people we love leave behind more than just memories. They leave behind the harvest of who they were, a love that keeps growing long after they're gone, showing up right when we need it most. Have you ever had a blessing like that show up in your life, from a seed someone planted for you long ago? If you have, I'd surely love to hear your story in the comments below. Take care now.